welcome back for our second week around this topic of overcoming lust. And today we're really leaning into how God is for healthy marriages, healthy homes, healthy kids, even healthy singles. Like He's healthy people.
Right. You know, it's interesting that from the very beginning of God's story in Genesis, we kind of see Him map out some realities about His design for us, how we function in community. We're designed. Remember when Adam was alone, that wasn't good. He needed a helpmate, and He gives us language of how we're designed to leave our parents and cleave to one another, right? And that the two become one person. This mysterious union takes place, that we're created male and female to complement one another in a beautiful way. What an incredible creator we have in God.
And then we know that sin crept into the world and there's a lot of brokenness in our relationships now that God intended to be these beautiful things, but now a lot of times we experience both the beauty of those relationships, but also a lot of pain and tragedy. Most of our stories would contain some brokenness in relationship, just across the board.
Yeah. And again, a sensitive topic today as we lean into what Jesus is trying to communicate here about marriage, and then even about failed marriage, about divorce and how that impacts us and some of the fallout that comes from that. And so again, with great sympathy, we come humbly in this teaching, trying to echo and understand what our King is trying to reveal to us in this. My own family story, as many of yours in the room, has been marked by this type of brokenness. I remember learning early on about my grandmother who had 6 children and was in an abusive marriage, and actually one day packed all of her kids up in their station wagon to try to flee the home while her husband was out. And when he got home and discovered that they were missing, he ended up chasing them down the road and kind of running the car off the road. What an incredible experience. When my dad was very young when all of this happened, but I've watched the family dynamic in my extended family play out now for decades. And the brokenness that came from just a very real life scenario, that there's still probably fallout that people are working through and that the extended family is impacted by. And so I just want to say, everybody in this room today has a story, and you have your own story, and we don't want to just paint with a broad brush here and pretend like your story doesn't matter or that God doesn't see you and recognize what you are walking through or have walked through. So we want to kind of lay the groundwork for that. As we're also then saying what we believe the King is kind of stating again as a standard or as truth, while meeting us with such deep grace.
Yeah, I think that, as you've been reading today in your groups some of Jesus' teachings around this topic in Matthew 5 during the Sermon on the Mount, where there's just like a brief snippet, and then a more extended teaching of Jesus around this topic in Matthew 19. Maybe it's worth mentioning kind of the backdrop to this is that there was broken relationship, and a tool that the people were given to help make a wrong less wrong was divorce, and that a woman couldn't just be set aside and then just set aside, right? Like she had to be given this certificate of divorce so that she could move on with her life, and so that she could, seek out remarriage or whatever. Like this was a tool that was given. Jesus would say, because of your hard hearts or because of the brokenness of your relationship. But, Jesus' point was like, this wasn't the plan in the first place. This isn't the goal. And I guess it's worth also noting then, again, that this is Jesus' invitation to his disciples to be salt and light, to be different from the world, to come out of the world and the way the world does things and to embrace a different way.
Right.
So it's not really maybe Jesus being so preachy, about it.
And I guess that's where we have a hard time, even as we're trying to communicate this, in stating truth or a standard of God's kingdom, and really going back to that original creation design. But while stating truth, that doesn't mean there's a lack of compassion for where brokenness has occurred, right? But we don't shy away from the truth in what this is, because if we can prevent, I think it's just Jesus' heart, if he can prevent brokenness, if he can remind us of the original design of the Creator, right? And the way that, frankly, the world just is meant to operate, and when we go against the grain of that, it hurts. We're going to get splinters. There's going to be what we might word as undeniable consequences of going against God's design.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That no one can say that there aren't consequences to sin and to our brokenness, right? And we all feel the splinters, like when divorce happens in our families and the fallout from that, or when, even beyond divorce, just broken relationship, broken homes, anger in the homes, like all these kinds of things leave pain in their wake, and that can't just be written off or removed. We live with real consequences. But I love how you also say, like, there's also redemptive potential. You have to hold both of those. Yes, there's undeniable consequences when relationships fall apart, but there's also always redemptive potential.
I watched in my grandmother's story, what the grandmother that I grew up knowing was this woman who did not walk away from God after her marriage broke apart. And frankly, there was a lot of fallout and difficulty in the lives of her children, but she felt called of God. She became a minister of the gospel. She ended up turning her brokenness into a redemptive story where she worked with women in a homeless shelter and a rehab center and helping share God's redemptive plan for them. I just watched God redeem and work through her life. She eventually was remarried, and they lived a faithful life for God together, her and who I knew as my grandpa. And so absolutely the beauty of a God who doesn't compromise or overlook what could really break hearts and trouble souls and wound us, right? He's not going to overlook that because he wants wholeness. And he wants to prevent that kind of wounding and brokenness wherever possible. But then a God who makes provision for redemptive hope, right? Where brokenness has occurred.
So it's like, on the one hand, we need to guard against this tendency in our culture to put our personal happiness as the supreme thing, and at the cost of those around us, maybe. Like, Jesus seems to be concerned about the children. Often his teaching on divorce is immediately followed by a teaching about the value of children. And we know, from research that divorce isn't great for kids. Like, that, there's no way to shy around from that. And so, like, to recognize, like, hey, I need to be careful with divorce. It's not, and I think that's a lot of what Jesus was saying to his culture that was not being careful with it, and was just like, yeah, well, whatever. I can just move on and find something that make me happier, and it's like, hold on. Hold on. There's undeniable consequence.
And even asking, is that really going to make you happier?
Sure.
And is it going to be the thing that's going to benefit your children and your family and your community and the society around you, even at large? Kind of, again, the scope of the King seeing what's good for all of creation in this, and causing us to ask hard questions of ourselves when we're in a marriage that's struggling, or frankly, if we're single and we're considering who it is that we would marry. That's not a flippant decision, that it's not a trivial thing that we would take lightly, both who we would marry once we're married, that it's not flippant that we would move outside of that relationship.
So on the one hand, we raise the bar of God's standard and what Jesus is calling us into as his way, On the other hand, we also need to raise our value of grace and what that can do and the power of that, because sometimes we sell ourselves short and we think, oh, I'm damaged goods now because of this in my past, or, this has happened to me, so what? But your grandmother's story is such a cool example, and there's so many stories like that we could all tell of God's faithfulness in a broken situation to bring about incredible things for his kingdom.
And I just wonder if that might be some of the ways this conversation works itself out as we choose not to shy away from it as a congregation. The beauty of spiritual family is there's so many different stories in our community. Some people who have walked through divorce and are even remarried now, some of them, and the redemptive story. And how could your redemptive story help a struggling couple, help encourage someone, help warn them about some of the fallout that came from that decision, or give hope to somebody who also is walking through circumstances maybe that are outside of their control, and being able to bring a sense of grace and promise to them. How could we encourage singles in our congregation and young adults who are trying to figure out who it is that would be their helpmate in life, and finding someone to share life together with in covenant marriage? What does that look like for us to come alongside them in that season of life? I think what we see here is that the King cares about this. He cares about who we share life with, and frankly, who we become one with. That's the mysterious union and design of marriage.
I guess one thing I would tag on the end of this conversation that I feel like gets left out a lot is the value of a single life, that Scripture values a single life as well. And sometimes we get so hung up on conversations around marriage and divorce, and I can just imagine that there's like lifelong single people who are like, hello. But the good news is that there's that beautiful history of that in the church, of people who lived a single life devoted to the Lord, and that is an honored thing as well in Scripture, honored by God, should be honored by the church as well.
Well, we hope that you'll have some discussion together that again honors one another and honors our King.